Everybody. I'm Muqtadar Khan. I'm a professor of international relations, American foreign policy, and Islamic thought at the University of Delaware. I'm delighted to participate in this timely symposium on counter narratives for preventing and countering violent extremism. In Europe, you use the word PVE, I guess, preventing violent extremism. And in the United States, we tend to use the word CVE. At least we used to during the Obama administration. I'm extremely delighted to participate on behalf of Beyond Horizon, a think tank which has an interesting vision for US and Muslim relations, Europe and Muslim relations, and also for the future of Europe itself. I think what Beyond Horizon has to offer is a vision of Europe that is multicultural, inclusive, safe, peaceful, and essentially to make Europe an example for relations between Asia and Europe, especially between Europe and the Muslim world, especially the Middle East. So I intend to do two things in this talk. I wish I was with you all at the Brussels Press Club, but I guess this will do. I have two areas in which I will be commenting on today. The first one is I will be talking about the necessity of winning the battle in rhetoric and ideology uh, with regards to the rise of Islamic extremism and Muslim extremism, not just in the Muslim world, uh, but also in many Western countries. So essentially, the first part of my talk will be to emphasize the importance of the ideological dimension of countering the extremism, for example, of ISIS, the remnants of Al Qaeda, and other extremist movements that proliferate across the world and particularly in the Muslim world. The second thing that I will also try to do is to talk a little bit about narratives, countering narratives, and it has become a fad now to argue that we need to develop a counter narrative, and there are many bouquet think tanks and even large think tanks which are devoting a lot of resources to this task of developing counter narratives. Uh, and I think many of them actually miss the point, and I will explain to you how and why. So let me begin by talking about the fact that this war on terror, or this struggle against extremism, has many dimensions to it. And usually the term Islamic terrorism, Islamic extremism is employed on both sides of the Atlantic. Uh, when I use the word domestic terrorism, I will use it in the way it is used by American law enforcement and American scholars of terrorism and extremism. It is essentially a code word to say non Muslim terrorism. So, in spite of the efforts of the Obama administration, in spite of the efforts of academics and Muslim communities and civil rights organizations, both in Europe and the United States, Muslims have not been able to de-link the two terms, terrorism and Islamic. And in fact, right now, the President of the United States insists that that is how we should talk about the only threat that the world faces, including the United States, as Islamic terrorism. So when the word domestic terrorism is used, it is used to refer to terrorism and extremist actions committed by those who are not Muslims. So even if somebody is a second generation or a third generation Muslim, born, say, in France or in the United States and commits an act of terrorism or even buys a ticket to join ISIS, that term domestic terrorism is at least not used to implicate them. And there's a philosophical underpinning to this, which is the foreignness of Islam, treating Islam and Muslims as foreigners, even if they have been here for centuries and for generations. So that is an important point to understand. As far as the United States is concerned, in the past few years, we have noticed that terrorism, which is of the domestic nature, which is right-wing terrorism or or otherwise, has exceeded in terms of incidences and the number of deaths than terrorism, which is attributed to Islamic actors and Muslims. So, in that sense, as far as terrorism is concerned, the so-called Islamic terrorism is not the biggest threat in the United States. Secondly, many actions committed by Muslims are very easily and quickly classified as extremism or terrorism. For example, if a young person who is 17 or 18 buys a ticket to Istanbul with the intention of joining ISIS, that is also classified as terrorism. But a man could walk into a what should I call it, a rock concert and shoot 59 people dead and 500 people injured, and it would not be classified as terrorism. Even the incident in South Carolina where a white extremist walked into a black church and killed 9 people was not classified as terrorism at all. So essentially, what happens is the the data inflates actions by Muslims in the United States, at least, and deflates actions and terrorist events that are perpetrated by domestic actors. Having said that, I also want to share with you the idea that in America, at least, lawnmowers kill more people than the so called Islamic terrorists. On an average, about 60 plus people are killed by lawnmowers in the United States. So, having the point I'm trying to make is we need to understand the context of this threat. In Western societies, it is not as significant as it is elsewhere. Maybe in Europe, it is a much more serious threat than in the United States. When we talk about this so called struggle against extremism, this war on terrorism, it has 3 dimensions to it. And one of those dimensions is essentially combating the rhetoric and ideology of groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda and others, from Muslim Brotherhood to Hamas, etc., which are Muslim actors seeking political change in domestic and international politics. So the 3 dimensions of this so-called war on terror, I classify them as: one is a struggle which is territorial and military. And we saw that in the war against ISIS, a coalition of countries came together to essentially defeat the Islamic State. The Caliphate, which really began in 2014, reached its peak by about 2016 and collapsed uh, by 2017. Or it's still there. Very little territory is controlled by ISIS, but more or less the territorial existence of ISIS has disappeared, and it has been defeated militarily. So these kind of actions where police or military actions are taken is one dimension. You can call it straightforward counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and essentially, in the case of ISIS, it was a major war. But use of force essentially is one dimension in combating terrorism. The critical aspect of this dimension became necessary and apparent after the rise of ISIS. ISIS is essentially Al Qaeda 2.0. Al Qaeda was a global or is a global terrorist organization motivated by certain Islamic sentiments, Islamic ideas, seeking to advance a vision for Muslim glory, peace, etc., whatever you want to define what the Caliphate stands for. But their policy was to strike wherever they could, whenever they could, and they never achieved control over territory, even though in partnership with Taliban they did have access to large swaths of lands where they could build training camps, such as in Afghanistan. However, ISIS went one step further beyond Al Qaeda. It actually captured territory and actually tried to govern it like a state with quite a bit of degree of bureaucratization, systematization, and its military success and its ability to establish a more or less functioning state for a brief period, given by the standards of the Middle East, it was not too far away in terms of its ability to function as a state. There are many failed states in the region, and ISIS was one of them. ISIS became an inspiration for a lot of people in that it was achieving success, and its military success and its capacity to hold territory and govern that territory became a source of inspiration for a lot of young people in many parts of the Muslim world, from Paris all the way to Tunisia. And in spite of the fact that Tunisia was having perhaps the only successful Arab Spring, uh, thousands of people from Tunisia joined ISIS to fight for it because of the inspiring effect of his control on territory and ability to establish a government. So, in that sense, militarily defeating ISIS was absolutely essential because the appeal of his rhetoric, the appeal of his ideology, the appeal of his vision was strengthened by its military success, and its military defeats then automatically transferred to its ideology and vision. So, as in 2015 and 16, their vision and their ideology seemed like a successful vision and ideology. They were fighting the world and succeeding. And from 2017 onwards, it's very clear that that ideology and that vision is not successful. It is quite possible that it may occur to many people when these kind of groups are defeated militarily that perhaps God is not with them and God is against them. And I think that would be very powerful. So do not underestimate the value of military defeats of organizations which are established like ISIS, the defeat of Boko Haram, the shrinking of the influence of perhaps the Taliban in Afghanistan. Military defeats would definitely diminish their appeal and their value and their capacity to spread wherever they do spread. The second part is essentially to deal with the structural and material conditions which inspire, create these organizations and these movements. The Muslim world is proliferating with extremist organizations. Nearly every part of the Muslim world has some kind of an extremist group seeking political change by using terrorism as their means. Some are peaceful and some are violent, and the violent ones tend to be more inclined towards terrorism than insurgency or rebellion. And the reason why they occur so often and so frequently is because that there are some fundamental flaws in the structure of the Muslim world and the global structure. So, for example, you could develop a counter narrative to counter Muslim grievances about the lack of the Palestinian state and how Palestinians are treated by Israel and America and the Western countries. No amount of rhetoric, no matter how much money you spend in developing counter narratives in comic forms and videos, TVs, etc., cannot fundamentally convince anybody in the world that the Palestinians do not have a state and they are suffering, and their suffering is primarily because of the policies, the power, the ideology, and the religious commitments of Western leaders and Western countries. So these are some structural problems, the inequities in the Muslim world. America's support for authoritarian regimes. Look at how in the past few months the United States has consistently stood by the Saudi Arabian regime, which is increasingly seen as oppressive and tyrannical. And not only are we supporting Saudi Arabia, we are willing to lie. President Trump is willing to undermine the credibility of American institutions, but not challenge the credibility of the Saudi regime. And these kind of actions of ours, these are not just narratives, these are policies, these are actions. They perpetuate injustices, they perpetuate authoritarianism, they undermine the hope and promise of democracy in the Muslim world. They perpetuate unequal distribution of wealth within countries and between countries in the Muslim world. So these are structural problems that exist in the Muslim world, which are to some extent the consequences of the colonization of the Muslim world by European nations, and then subsequently the perpetuation of the post-colonial order by Western countries. The eagerness of France to intervene in Mali, the eagerness of the United States to intervene in Iraq, and so on and so forth, continues to tell many Muslims that there are fundamental problems in the structure of the global order, and the biggest sufferers are Muslims. Tremendous injustice is being done to them in many, many ways. There's an absence of states in Kashmir, in Palestine, in Kurdistan, etc. So, as long as there is also a dimension to address these economic and political injustices and inequities, no amount of rhetoric and no amount of narratives are going to be successful as long as these structural flaws exist. It's like saying, what can you tell the Palestinians in Gaza to forget about their misery and be friendly and positive towards the West. I would really love to see someone build that narrative. And if you think that any think tank, any scholar can provide you a narrative to essentially diffuse the disenchantment of Palestinians in Gaza, then I have a bridge that I would love to sell you. It'll be useful. It is a bridge to the future. So that is the second part. So when we talk about developing counter narratives, when we talk about developing ideological structures, we need to be able to address these two things fundamentally. And so essentially have a three-pronged strategy. Address the territorial and military challenges that are posed by extremist groups, whether towards Western countries directly or towards Muslim countries. That is important. Defeat them militarily, reduce the appeal of their vision by reducing their success on the ground. The number two thing to do is to address the economic and socio-political conditions that create or inspire these people to go out there, especially now with global media and social media. News spreads fast and furiously across the world, and there's also a lot of fake news. So the challenge to address how events are spun, especially by ideologues in the Muslim world, is very important. Finally, what Muslim groups in the last 150 or 200 years has succeeded is developing an ideology that basically addresses some fundamental grievances that many Muslims across the world experience. And those are well known. The colonization of Muslim world, the abuse and rape of their natural resources, the wars against Muslim world. Look at the war in Yemen today, for example. Uh, Without the United States support, active participation, intelligence, financial, military, Saudi Arabia will not be able to kill and maim and destroy one nation completely. And the consequences of what is happening in Yemen is yet to come. But I can tell you that right now, Muslim youth all over the world are looking at certain injustices which are not being addressed by anybody in the West. And in fact, Western countries are seen as colluding with these injustices. For example, the situation in Yemen. Look at the situation with Muslims in Myanmar, and also look at what's happening to Muslims, obviously, in Palestine, but also in Iraq and Syria, uh, etc. The millions of Muslim refugees from Syria and Iraq. This suffering is essentially creating a sense of tremendous disenchantment and discontent with the global order. I myself, as a professor of international relations, refuse to accept the success and the rhetoric of institutions of global governance like the Security Council and the United Nations by simply pointing to injustices that haven't been addressed in the Muslim world. I don't care how successful the United Nations might be in Ireland, but its utter failure in the Arab world to bring peace and security tells me that global governance has failed. And so that is an important thing for us to remember, that the Muslim world has a strong feeling of injustices, and Islamic groups have really tapped into them. And in the past 150 years, going as far back as to Jamaluddin Afghani and subsequently Maulana Maududi in South Asia, Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, Sayyid Qutb in the Arab world, they created this perception that the reason why Muslims suffer is because Islam is not in power. So there are a plethora of ideological interpretations of the world and advocacies for Islamization of the world that has been spreading in the world to some extent that I feel that up to 30 to 40% of the Muslim world is being Islamized in their thinking. Even those who come to the West and live in the West and enjoy democracy, pluralism, secularism, religious tolerance, not only enjoy it but engage with it successfully politically, have some kind of sympathies to the Islamist rhetoric that Muslims are being treated badly in this world, primarily by the West. And the only way Muslims will be able to address this dire situation is by developing a unified Muslim world in which Islam will govern, and through Islam, God's grace and God's mercy will be earned, and Muslims will not only be able to undo the injustices that are being done to them, but will also occupy uh, the position that is natural and deserving to them by virtue of being Muslims, which is to be global moral leaders. The Khilafah of the world should be in the hands of Muslims. God says so in the Quran. The leadership is for Muslims, and so should it be. So, this is an ideology that has been spread for 200 years, but this ideology also has subsets in it. And those subsets are localized and often responding to local geopolitical situation or local political circumstances. So, for example, if you go to India, you will hear Indian Muslims say in poetry as well as in prose, and quite frequently, that whenever India needed blood, it was the Muslims who sacrificed their blood. But now Hindus who have come to power in India say that Muslims are foreigners and have no place in India. So this whole argument that Muslims are being treated as foreigners in the countries that they governed for 1,000 years and fought against colonizers for hundreds of years. So that is a local sense of injustice, a local disenchantment. And so the rhetoric of Muslims that emerges there is a response to the local argument. But it also plugs into the global rhetoric that is coming from Islamists, that Muslims need to return to Islam in order to find self respect, in order to find unity, and in order to find divine support to restore injustices. There's a verse in the Quran which says that God will not change the condition of Muslims, or God will not change the condition of people until they change what is fundamentally inside them. And this is an often cited verse in most of the Muslim ideological discussions, where they say what they're saying essentially is that the structural conditions of the Muslim world will not alter unless the nature of Muslim agencies are changed. And therefore, Muslim groups, Muslim organizations, Muslim states, which are agents of Islam and Muslims, must change and become Islamic in order that the global structure then will be changed by God and they will be restored to their primacy, which they think is their birthright by virtue of being Muslims. So, the second part in my discussion is this, that in order to combat this phenomena of Muslim extremism, you cannot do that by trying to crush Islam and Muslims. Muslims are about one fourth of the world's population, and about 30 to 40% of Muslims everywhere are clearly influenced by the ideology and vision of Islamism. Then there are those, of course, who feel that Islam is the source of Muslim backwardness, and the reason why Muslims are being oppressed is because they're religious, not modern, etc. So there is a segment that is secularized and wants to essentially westernize, but unfortunately they're not that very motivated. They are not willing to take those risks that the Islamists are willing to take. And unfortunately for the Muslim world, the secular intellectual westernized elite is corrupt to the core. Khomeini said something very interesting. He said, look at every document which sold Muslim resources to the West. You will never find a signature of an Islamist or a Muslim scholar on it. These are only secular Western intellectuals who sell the Muslim world to the West. So you have people like Sisi, the so called secular. He's a tyrant. We don't label him terrorist in spite of what he does. But if a Muslim is a member of the Islamic Brotherhood or other organization, commits an act of violence, he is considered a terrorist, and Islam then gets the blame. Sisi is also Muslim, but his actions do not undermine the image of Islam. We don't call it Islamic authoritarianism. So, unfortunately, secular westernized elites, whether it is the monarchs, the king of Jordan or king of Saudi Arabia or UAE, or whether it are the dictators in the other parts of the Arab world, the English educated Bashar al Assad or the American educated Sisi, these all secularists are essentially authoritarian. So for Muslims really who are seeking global change, this is a very, very powerful ideology. So do understand that the challenge is very fundamental. So how do we combat this global ideology? There are two or three ways to do that. One is obviously to have a global narrative to counter the global narrative of Islamism, whether it is peaceful or violent. Either of it, the vision is the same. Replace monarchies with Islamized government. So what Taliban are saying and ISIS are saying, and for that matter, Imran Khan and Erdogan are saying to some extent, is very same. The means are different. Some are advocating democracy to achieve this Islamization. Others are advocating for violence to achieve the same goals. But nevertheless, that thing needs to be interrogated and asked. So what? How do we know that Islam will cause Muslims to return to glory? The West is glorious, the West is powerful, the West is dominant, and it doesn't have Islam. So how come Muslims will be dominant, powerful, influential only if they have Islam? What is the connection between religious beliefs and political power? That is a question which has not been challenged significantly. So that's something that needs to be done on a global level to fundamentally question this assumption that Islamization will lead to power. We have examples of Iran. Would Iran be happy with what it has achieved since 1979? It has become a pariah state to a great extent. Its people have suffered for decades because of the policies of the country, which are geared more towards preserving its religious identity than providing welfare for its people. So that is one level at which you challenge to develop a global narrative which questions this fundamental assumption. The second assumption is from an Islamic perspective, and this is a task for Muslim intellectuals, is does Islam really teach that? Islam is a religion for submission, not domination. Islam means submission, not domination. It doesn't mean ghalaba. It means aslama, to submit. And so it is very important for Muslims to question is what is the role of the state? What is the role of power within religious communities? And that is a conversation that has been going on. There are debates between Islamic modernists and so-called Islamic fundamentalists, which are being recorded in books, but those kind of debates do not really happen publicly much because anybody who comes from a religious background, at least in Western countries, is essentially treated very badly. And even though there has been a lot of talk about empowering moderate Islam against radical Islam, that has nearly never really translated because Western countries, even while understanding that moderate and traditional Islam is powerful and important to combat the radical streak that exists now, anybody who challenges Western hypocrisy or exposes Western injustices and domination, regardless of what kind of Islam they practice, are immediately labeled extremist and isolated. So that is a problem that Western countries are unable to act on their policies with integrity. As a result of that, many moderate Muslims have not been able to become powerful. We tend to label people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali as moderate Muslims who are probably not even Muslims. And so this it not only undermines the credibility of their rhetoric, which appeals only to Westerners, and they make money off it. And so that kind of counter narratives developed by people who reject Islam and who essentially develop a discourse which is contemptuous towards Muslims, denies the injustices that are done to Muslims is not going to work. So that is the first step, to develop a global narrative which challenges a Muslim understanding of history today as to why the West is dominant, especially in the Muslim world. Why is it that no Muslim country has literally bombed the US, whereas the US has bombed nearly every other country? So that is the first step. The second step is then to get down to individual groups' narratives. So there's a narrative that is coming from Hamas, there is a narrative that is coming from Hezbollah, and there's a narrative that is coming from Abu Sayyaf, from the Taliban, from ISIS, Al Qaeda, and that is a different one. We have to develop country specific, region specific narratives and policies. I want to make a couple more observations about narratives. The word narrative can be misleading. Uh, do not assume that narrative is just storytelling and spinning. Think of it more in terms of praxis, what you say and what you do. So it is very important that the policies that we implement, the policies that we articulate, are also consistent with the narrative that we want to advance. So, for example, President Trump, after he became president, he promised that he would clinch the deal of the century and solve the Arab Israeli problem. And then he proceeds to unilaterally transfer United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The disparity between the rhetoric and the disparity and his actions speak louder than whatever narrative he and his son-in-law uh, is trying to develop about the Middle East peace plan. And the same is true. One of the things that is really going to undermine any effort of Western media, Western opinion makers, Western scholars, and Western governments to counter the narrative of Islamists and extremists in the Muslim world is the rise of Islamophobia in Western countries. The argument that ISIS is intolerant and ISIS is exclusionary, whereas the West is tolerant and pluralistic and respects human rights, is constantly challenged by increasing acts of Islamophobia, not just by individuals, but sometimes by governments too. And the rise of right wing extremism in European countries, often as a reaction to fear of Islam and Muslims in European countries, contributes, is a narrative which essentially reinforces the vision of the extremists in the Muslim world. So it is very difficult uh, for those who are involved in the task of preventing radicalization or countering it, is by uh, I mean, how do you deal with these policy problems? So, I once got into a Twitter argument with somebody who probably represented an extremist group in the Arab world, and he said something to me which was also said to me by a student while I was giving a lecture in Morocco. This is what they fundamentally asked me. They stood up and said, how many Muslims will your country, America, have to kill before you come and join us in our war against America? It's a very difficult question to answer because at that time the United States was engaging in a war in Iraq, and I, as someone who's challenging the narratives of Al Qaeda at that time and Islamic extremists, could not develop a narrative saying that no, America is not involved in attacking Muslim countries because it was. So how do we go about doing this? How do we go and justify and try to even spin and say, no, this is not a war against Muslims, this is a war against extremism, war and terrorism, and then you have Senator Cruz and then you have people like Donald Trump stand up and say, no, this is a war against Islamic terrorism, with emphasis on Islamic. And there goes our entire effort at developing a narrative that the Western countries understand and sympathize with the plight of Muslims, but they also would like to deal with the situation with respect to human rights and law and order rather than use of violence and terrorism. Give me a second, sorry. So it is important for us to understand that these narratives have to be developed in conjunction with actual policies. Three things: that policies do not contradict the narratives. Only then will the narratives be strengthened. Number one. Number two, the West, at least the governments that are launching CVE and PVE initiatives, must also be seen as being active against Islamophobia as they are active against anti Semitism and other forms of racism. Number three, this narrative that will be constructed will be premised on the fact that Western countries and societies respect human rights, are inclusive, respect religious freedom, and are pluralistic. And that has to be demonstrated in policies, especially when it comes to refugee policies and injustices overseas. I hope that this brief discussion of mine was beneficial. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me and I'll be happy to answer them. And I hope to be in Brussels sometime soon, and then we can continue this conversation more face to face. But let me re-emphasize that this is an important conversation to have. This very dialogue that we are having is a powerful form of counter-narrative because we are looking at ourselves critically and also looking at the Muslim world critically, which is something that Islamists never do. Thank you very much.